Good morning again. I'd like to welcome you to our workshop today, where we're going to have a look at the role of some standards, specifically some CSA standards, on potential ways ahead of MSD prevention here in Ontario. I've got a few brief announcements for us, as always, and beginning in the usual fashion, indicate our fire exits and where the washrooms are. And what this doesn't acknowledge is that the whole back wall is a fire exit. But still. Also, in terms of some housekeeping, we do have Wi-Fi here in CHSI, and you can see that there. CHSI 8 laptop is the password there. So, in continuing those issues, if you do have questions, please use the mics, because we are video and audio recording, and this will be available on our website later on. And so if you do have an issue with video recording, please let us know. Okay, standards, MSD prevention. So all of us in the room, I believe, have an interest in MSD prevention and how we can best go about that. You also are probably aware that over the last 7 years, I believe, perhaps the most common go-to documents are those that were created out of the OSHCO group and called the MSD Prevention Guidelines, a series of 5 booklets that have been available through the WSIB and MOL websites for a long time. 7 years is a long time, as our speaker will tell you. And it's time perhaps to re-examine that document and series of documents. Coincidentally, we also have a set of new standards that are coming out of the CSA, Canadian Standards Association. And we're going to hear a little bit about those. And the reason for today's meeting, workshop, and I say workshop because you're going to be doing quite a lot of work, is what are the relationships between these new series of standards, the Z1000 series of standards, the MSD guidelines, and how we might want to move ahead in future with MSD prevention here in Ontario. I'm not going to cite numbers and figures about the challenges of MSDs, both in terms of personal suffering, disability, and the costs associated with MSDs. But we do need to think about how we address these going forwards. So what are we going to do? Are we going to stay with our MSD guidelines? Are we going to throw them off the train and go with the new CSI series, Z1000, Z1004, Workplace Ergonomics? Are we going to blend them? Are we going to go to something else? Because one of the things I would suggest is that it would be nice to have an overall strategy that people in Ontario could say, this is the direction we're going to go in. You may disagree, and I'd certainly like to hear about that. But that is the reason, I think, that this workshop came about. How can we move ahead in a unified way? And this especially now ties in with the new prevention organization, who we're going to hear from with our opening speaker. And so the feeling and comments of the room, I think, could be very useful in moving ahead on this. So our opening speaker, Ron Lewis from the new prevention organization, is stuck in traffic, as I believe there was a number of people here in the room are. And so we're going to do a little bit of a flip. I'm going to start with an introduction, and if Brian is not here, we'll move into our second speaker. So we may be moving ahead a little bit on the agenda. So we may be mixing it up there. My name is Richard Wells, as you may know, and I'm the director of CRE-MSD, who is putting on this workshop. And you're probably aware that our mission is not only to make sure that we go ahead in prevention of MSD with the best information and knowledge, but also to bring that knowledge to people on the front line, practitioners and others who are trying to prevent MSD in the workplace, and also to facilitate discussions. And I see that aspect of our work is very important, discussions among people such as yourselves, practitioners, organized labor, employers, because we're all in this together. We've got lots of different kinds of jobs out there. And many of you are in sectoral organizations that deal with some of those jobs. We have a number of different outcomes. And this slide actually is really old. This is a slide I created the very first year I heard about RSI. And I thought, what the heck is RSI? And so at the time, I went through the literature and tried to figure out what it was. And this mess was what came about. And this is only upper limb. And so this is what we're trying to prevent, as well as other MSDs. In Ontario, we have a number of prevention approaches. And I've put a number up here. And I guess what we could do is we could have people go around and see if they can identify everything. But I think we'll see that there are a number of approaches. On your right, we have some of the CSA standards, which we'll be introducing to you today if you're not familiar with them. We have the 5 booklets of the WSIB OSHCO guideline. We have a number of publications around participative ergonomics, which is one process that is frequently used in the prevention of MSDs. We also have down in the bottom right an ISO standard. We have in different places, we have some different tools that we might use with those processes. And so we need both, as I see it, some overall process, some general approach, plus some tools that we can use within workplaces for hazard identification and risk assessment. And we're going to touch a little bit on that last comment about tools, but mainly the purpose of today is to come up with a feeling in the room about what is the general approach. Now, I mentioned that we're going to be doing a little bit of work, and so I'd just like to point out a couple of documents within your package. You have some yellow papers, and you have some green papers. The green papers are some definitions of elements of an occupational health and safety management system that actually mimic those of Z1000. And so those are some definitions about what those general elements mean. The yellow document is one you're going to become intimately familiar with, because down the left-hand side we have a list of those elements. And over the course of today, specifically this morning and just after lunch, we're going to see how the different approaches, those from CSA Z1000, 1004, from the OSHCO prevention series, and your organization, map onto these occupational health and safety management system elements. And what we find could be quite interesting, I believe. We could find that there are complete concordance with the management system elements. We might find there's only a few that match. And that might give us some clues what might be new value in the CSA Occupational Health and Safety Management System standards. So, although we have some time specifically set aside for you to work with this, I'd like you to bear this in mind through all the presentations this morning before we get there. So you can be making little notes on here, jotting down, so that when we actually come to work on this later in the morning, you've already got a start on it. There are extra ones available if you mess up. So, just to recap, what are the goals of today? Some of you may not have been very familiar with Z1004 before today, well, before last week. But because of the generosity of CSA, we have had access to a view-only copy of Z1004. And so I hope people availed themselves of that opportunity to see it in detail. And I'm sure that we'll hear a little more about that from Ron Meyer, who's a speaker from CSA. What's in a standard? I'll be summarizing that briefly. And as we go through and as I summarize that, again, you have some definitions and you have your yellow sheets. And on many of my slides, I'll put section numbers and pages so that you can start jotting down under the CSA Z1004 where these different elements are, so you can find them later on. Briefly, I'm going to talk about the relationship of Z1004 to some other MSD prevention approaches. Now, I can't do all of that, but basically I'm giving you an introduction to filling out the first two columns at least. And as I mentioned, what we're trying to find out is what is the new value that comes from Z1004 and what might be missing from Z1004. And so at the end of the day, when we have some discussion about how we might go forwards, we've got a basis on which to make that decision. We know what we're getting into if we do decide to, as I say, move with the current approach, adopt Z1000 series, or perhaps create some mix of those two. So that's the goals of today. And I'll very briefly review our agenda here. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce Brian Lewis, who's just arrived. So if you give me just 2 moments there, Brian, we can do that. We're then going to hear from John Tyson, who many of you know, but was intimately, exhaustively connected with the MSD prevention guideline. And he's going to refresh us on how we came to have that as a very common go-to guideline here in Ontario. We're then going to hear from Ron Myers from CSA about the general overview of the Z1000 series of standards. And then I will move into a discussion of how I see the elements of Z1004. And you probably know that I was on the Z1004 technical committee. And so whatever you don't like about Z1004, you can throw your fruit that you get from your lunch and break at me. We then move on to the work part of the day, in where we start working on our yellow sheets. I will note that we did distribute an earlier version of these sheets. However, we have reorganized it to make it easier for you. And so you can throw those original sheets away and use our yellow sheets. We then move more into the discussion part. When we look at these yellow sheets, where is the concordance? Where isn't it? What does that mean? And how can we move forward? And so at the end of the day, the goal is to say we've got this situation where we have a new prevention organization. We have a MSD guideline that's 7 years old. We have a new series of Z1000 standards. What do we think we might want to do in going forwards in an MSD prevention strategy, some ideas. And we've got a really good cross-section of people here in the room who are knowledgeable on these issues. And so we'll be distributing at the end of this not only the videotapes of the day, but also a report that summarizes your feelings and your suggestions for us. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, who is going to welcome us and set the tone for the day, Brian Lewis, who is a vice president in the new prevention organization. And I hand it over to you, Brian.